What we're going to talk about today is the concept of deviations. Deviations don't really get talked about in a public setting or a group setting very often because of the nature of deviations. I passed out a short handout that's essentially an outline of the things that we're going to go over, just so that you have a solid takeaway. Feel free to make notes. We'll have a section at the end where people can ask questions, follow-ups, more details, etc. And whatnot, and I'm super open to that. But I need to start with the disclaimer that deviations are automatically not normal. That when you are deviating, that if you are doing something that is normal, you are not deviating. And that also includes thinking about how do we arrive at deviations. So these are pointers of things that I personally have learned over the years, I've heard other people learn over the years on how they arrive at processing through a deviation, but there is no secret formula on this equals deviation. It turns out if there's something consistent enough that we have a formula for it, we either put it into the documents and it becomes a process, or we recognize that while this is something we'll handle reasonably consistently, it's not worth putting into the documents because the documents have a very wide audience and the thing that's coming up happens to be for a very narrow audience. A simple example of that is how do we handle video coverage folks? We automatically give them time extensions related to starts and stops because of video coverage, which doesn't happen at normal events. So we're not going to put that into a document. We're just going to handle that at a Star City Open or at a Magic Fest because those are very particular events. And having a guy who is, in the middle of Indiana at an LGS trying to run MCQ, having to read something about video coverage delays is not worth the space that goes in the document. So let's start with that disclaimer. Now, the next thing that I want to cover before we get into the actual details of deviation is a reality of being a high-level judge and being in charge of a large event. It used to be that there were L4 judges, now we have Grand Prix head judges. The things that I learned as an L4 and a Grand Prix head judge still apply for folks that are running Magic Fest or people that are doing events on the Star City Tour that are high-profile events. The reality of these is the things that you do are going to get talked about. People are going to either see it in coverage, or they'll read about it in a tournament report, or they'll see it on Reddit. And so the actions that you take in one of those roles has a wider impact on the Magic community as a whole. We've all probably heard times where someone's like, oh, at this GP, at this Magic Fest, I heard that Eric Levine did this thing, and that's suddenly people are like, oh, well, this must be how it's done. So, if you're ever in that position, or if you're ever observing folks that are in that position, you'll realize that while you have this great authority to change the event wildly, and you have this power of being a head judge, that when you are at those top level events, you're going to try and exercise it as minimally as possible, because every action a GP head judge takes, every action that the old L4s would take, almost by definition became policy. And so while you have great authority, you have almost no freedom. So many people back in the day would ask about how do I get to those advanced roles? And we'd have frank discussions about, do you want to have the freedom to pursue what you want? Do you want to have the freedom to perhaps make deviations that might be closer to the line rather than way over the line? And the reality is most people enjoyed their freedom. And GP head judges in old school L4s just didn't have that. They had to be super careful. Now, that still applies to you in your local events, in your MCQs, doing Star City Classics, doing Star City Opens, not to as high a degree because of the potential impact in there. But if you're the head judge of an MCQ, it's going to impact your community. And if you do a deviation, your community is going to be talking about it And you're gonna have to deal with the impact on your, say, reputation, if we borrow from John Oliver's presentation, and the impact of how people think about you when it comes to, do I wanna staff this person or not? You know, if you're someone who's like, I'm just gonna ignore policy and make up answers as deviations, you know, and someone's trying to staff for an event, they might be like, no, CJ, I can see you. I can see you back there. Or they might be like, I want someone who is going to stay closer to the documents, because the documents are what players and judges expect. So that's the illusion of freedom. We think of high-level judges as having lots of power. That's true. But with that power comes the restriction, being very careful about using it. The general rule, moving on to our next thing about, should you deviate? No, you just shouldn't. 9 times out of 10, and 5 times out of those other 10, you should not deviate. It's just true. Deviations are really actually only for the corner cases. Do not deviate because you feel like deviating. Do not deviate, especially because you don't like a policy. If you don't like a policy, talk to program leadership. If you don't like a policy, come up with a better version and then take that to the thing. Going up to Toby or a PC and saying, I really hate randomly determining a winner has this draconian thing. I have no solution for that, I just don't like it. It's never near as good as saying, hey, does this really have the impact that we think it does? Is it right to revisit this? Can we come up with a better solution? That's how policy develops over time. A lot of judges think that policy is only the high-level judges making their little ivory tower decisions and then foisted it on other people. The reality is, it's usually judges who are in the trenches doing the work, really not liking it, and the judges that are talking about policy as part of their function in the program, realizing I have a bunch of upset judges. So if you don't like a policy, the correct way to do that is express it to higher level people, express it to people that are part of policy groups and things like that, preferably with solutions. It's not to deviate because you disagree with policy. That will set up a bad reputation for you, and that will make high-level event folks not want to staff you, because we don't want to have a big event where we've got different people making different decisions where we can't predict what's going to happen. Because if I'm doing a Magic Fest and I have to deal with posts on Reddit because some judge in ODE land decided, you know, that wild things need to happen, like that's just super frustrating. All right? So step 1, basically do everything you can to avoid deviations. However, deviations exist in the documents for a reason, and that's because the documents are never intended as a exhaustive resource. As judges who have done this for a long time, who've leveled up in the system, you are probably super aware that the documents are long and boring and dry, and that's true. It is every bit true, and trying to cover every case is going to make it more complicated, more boring, more dry, and we are certainly at a point where we have diminishing returns. So, you know, we could go, okay, let's subdivide mistriggers into a couple different things. That might be a solution. We might like handling that better. We sort of already have. Beneficials and detrimentals are different. But if we actually keep doing that until we just, okay, everything's covered, the reality is we're going to have to deal with new things in the future as the game evolves. But there's also the reality of that's more stuff we have to learn. And the deviations policy as it exists on some level is sending us the signal of, if you're a judge and you've been in the system and you've been trusted with a staff such that you're the head judge of something of relevance, then we probably trust your actual personal judgment. So from here on, we're going to now talk about how do we look at things and how do we make those judgments about what's going on with the game, about what's going on with the players and the environment, so that when people look back, they think, okay, that was a reasonable deviation. Why we deviate? Let me actually cover a track here. And these things will pop up a couple times. You'll see the word trap on my list. Traps are things where these are common areas where I've seen or heard people deviate, and it's just, this is sort of the lure that said, oh, I need to go deviate, but it winds up being essentially a dead end. And this first one I want to talk about is something is going on, something's going wrong, and you're like, well, for prior experience or because of a potential bias, I'm just going to deviate. If you don't have an actual reason why you're deviating, then don't. After we go through this, hopefully it'll be very obvious that when you make the choice to deviate, it should be after you've considered it and after you've come up with actionable, defensible reasons for deviating. Please don't deviate just because something's hard and you want to not have to continue dealing with it. All right? So, why do we deviate? There are ultimately three things. You're the head judge. If you're not the head judge, you don't get to deviate. Now, there is a reality where sometimes you're going to be floor judging or team leading or whatever, and you're going to be like, here's this FUBAR situation, and you're going to want a deviation. You can go ask the head judge for one. You can start that like you would handle an appeal. I actually did that just this weekend with Alejandro. Walked up to him and was like, Alejandro, I would like a deviation. I just started with that. And then I explained the situation, and then he looked very sad and confused because it was FUBAR, and we talked about it a little bit, and he's like, okay, go take care of that. But I couldn't do that, even with my level or my experience or whatever my role was. In any given event, if you're not the head judge, you do not have the authority to deviate. But you can try and fast track that if you feel like you're in a position where deviation is appropriate. Please make that very clear to whoever your head judge might be for those events, and detail what your thought processes are. Second thing for criteria for deviating, the phrase in the document is significant and exceptional circumstances. Significant and exceptional are not actually otherwise defined in the document, so we'll cover what those are generally accepted to mean and why they're relevant. And then the last thing is incidents not covered by the rules. We covered that a little bit beforehand in talking about the bulk of the documents and how they cannot be exhausted. You know, you can have situations where like a player stands up, turns around, knocks things over, stuff goes sideways. Now you have to figure out how to handle it. You know, the documents aren't exhaustive. When you run into a thing where it's like, wow, there really isn't something in the document, that's going to lead to what might be a deviation, though you could argue if it's not in the document, there's nothing to deviate against. Let's just accept that the previously not in document stuff will categorize as deviation because the thought process you go through to figure out how do I resolve this are going to follow the same thought processes of how do I resolve a thing that is defined in the documents but doesn't quite work for reasons relevant to that exact scenario. All right, significant and exceptional. I have a special meaning in the heart of judges that have done this for a while because it's this weird amorphous situation. And so for incoming judges and judges that are like in the roles where you're at, where you are now going to be taking on these roles, these leadership positions, where you're going to have to make these decisions. Let's talk about what significant and exceptional means. First of all, if you are making a general ruling on the floor, and I have player A and player B, and I need to understand who is, we'll call it right or wrong. Sometimes they're just confused, not confused, or whatever, and you have to make a determination. A typical judge ruling is going to be what I think of as the civil criteria. In US law, if you are having a civil suit against a person, the criteria that's given to the jury is you must believe one thing to be more likely than another thing, which translates into essentially 51%. Once you hit 51% in a legal civil setting, that side wins. And that's how we typically handle our regular rulings. Now, when we get into investigations, people might say different numbers for percentages and stuff, but generally speaking, we're just like one side is more true, more correct, more believable, more accurate in their rules, more accurate in their recollection, whatever. That's a normal ruling. When you get into significant and exceptional, especially in the case of deviations, though investigations for cheating often are similar, you want to think more in terms of a criminal proceeding. And in US law, that's where you'll hear the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt. If you talk to legal experts in the US system and say, quantify what does beyond a reasonable doubt, they'll almost always give you at least 90%. Most people will give you, that are legal professionals, will say 95 or more percent. You'll note that in a group of 12 people, which is a typical jury, 95% is higher than you would divide 12 into 100. So basically everyone in that group agrees, in most court cases of a criminal nature, you have to have a unanimous jury. That's probably why they picked 95, is that nice high number. But when you're thinking, okay, I'm coming in, I haven't necessarily got the gut instinct for where does significant and exceptional come in. If you want to give yourself a baseline, divide it up that way. Typical rulings are civil, 51%. Your deviations are going to be criminal, that's 95+%. That's also a good way to remind yourself of, before everything else, I want to not deviate. This is only going to be for that little sliver of stuff that's gone real weird in some way. All right. The other thing about significant and exceptional, and this is why we hold deviations only to head judges. Until you've done a bunch of events, you don't know what normal is. Until you've seen, Grand Prix level magic, until you've been to Opens, until you've been to Classics, you don't have a baseline for what's typical. Here's a thing where, it's like, hey, this guy we now say, you mulled the 7, didn't you? The guy will be like, yep. And that's a convenient and easy shorthand, but for a judge who's coming in and not been exposed to that, he might not realize how typical and boring mulligan to 7 is. And so that's why you need to have some experience, doing that style of event before, and having players in those pressured situations or in those complex situations before you can really develop that feel. That isn't a strike against anyone, it's just recognize that's a reality. So if you're in a situation and you're like, I think this is worth deviating, and someone's like, let me walk you through it, and it turns out it's not, that might be a sign that more than experience will help you develop a good internal understanding of where that bar between significant and exceptional is. It's also very intentionally not defined for the same reason we don't define randomization. It used to be the document said in order to randomize your deck, you had to riffle shuffle at least 3 times. And so people would stack their deck and they'd riffle, and there it's randomized. Except we all know that's not. And so we'd say, okay, you must shuffle for a minute. And so they'd shuffle for 59 seconds. And as soon as we say, this is some measurable criteria where the bar is, then people are going to, whether it's players or judges, are going to say, okay, well, I will get out a yardstick and then I will pile up a bunch of facts and it's either taller or shorter than the stick. So that is why those phrases are kind of obtuse. But the way to solve that from your own experience is just do more events. Talking about the thing with Eric Levine earlier on staffing, one of the things that is awesome to put into your cover letters is things like that, where it's like, I want to get more competitive event experience because I am building for, I'm building up my skills for being a head judge. If you say, I want to do X because of Y, or I want to do X to reach Y, that will help in your cover letters, because it's not just, I like this thing. It tells you something in the narrative about where you're going with this. So understanding significant and exceptional is just a thing that takes time and effort. Also, a thing that really helps with that is talk to other judges about things they've heard. If you had a deviation or you had a call where you think this might be a deviation, talk with each other. The people in this room, in all honesty, are your best resources for getting yourself better and for building your own brand. You know, if Matt Marheny wants to build his brand as the setup teardown guy, he might realize John's that. I'm gonna seek John as a mentor, but Matt Marheny might also be good at rules knowledge. So someone else who is like, Jason Daniel, for example, might be like, I want rules knowledge. I heard Matt might be, I don't know if you are. I know you're good at tear up and set down, or set up and tear down. Yeah, tear up and set down. But it's like, we all have multiple skills, and conveniently, maybe John will help Matt with this, Matt will help Jason with that, and Jason will help someone else. And things like deviations, because they're so rare, go ahead and talk with each other about those things, because then your experience in having dealt with that, either as a judge who took a call where a head judge deviated, or you were the head judge and needed to deviate, the discussions that you have will allow the experience that you got or the experience that someone else got educate more of your community. All right? There is a single line on here that I think is actually very important to this, and that's why I left it as a single line. It says, understanding the nature of deviations is understanding the nature of the documents. And that doesn't mean the text of the documents. It's very easy to memorize the text of the documents. And I've seen people like in L3 panels who are good at the text of the documents, but they forget what the mission of the documents, what's the guiding reason for the documents. And if you look at the trajectory of the penalty guide, for example, which is where when we think deviations, we're not deviating of here's how magic rules work, we're deviating on here's how we punish people for breaking things, etc. If you look at the trajectory of the penalty guide, over the years, and players have gotten better at playing Magic, and we've gotten better at separating the good actors from the bad actors, we've realized we don't have to be draconian about our rules. It used to be if your deck list was illegal, 56 cards, well, you got DQ'd because I have no way of figuring out what those other 4 cards are. And then we realized perhaps that's bad. And we evolved that since. I talked about the randomly determining a winner earlier, specifically because that's a recent evolution. We've looked at things and realized maybe this doesn't need to be that way. But the theme that you see, if you look at the way things were to the way things now, is you'll realize our job as judges has evolved from being enforcers of rules into customer service people helping players play games. And so the nature of the documents now has become one of trying to protect integrity. Yes, that's still valid and important, but mostly about facilitating people playing the game that they love in a way that's non-disruptive to either their enjoyment of the game, such as having someone use foul language and personal attacks, or disrupting their understanding of the game of, no, that's not how the rules work, actually first strike applies in this case, those types of things. And talking about the nature of the document is another one of those things I think makes for a good community discussion. But if you track that trajectory, you'll find over time the changes that keep getting added in and the things that keep getting tweaked are more about us as facilitators and not as us as enforcers. So when we think about deviations going into the future, then let's think about things in terms of, okay, we're trying to facilitate players playing the game. We have our systems to verify that, to check versus them being bad actors. Let's just separate bad actors, get their own category, and we'll work on that. That's an investigation thing. So in all our examples, we're going to set aside that and just say, we believe they're good actors for whatever reason, and now we want to facilitate them playing the game more than we are enforcing a rule system. It's tempting to deviate purely as customer service to players. I've seen this many, many times. You're having a bad day, you had a bad thing happen, I can fix it, I'm a judge, I'm here for customer service, except you got an opponent. There's another person right there. And if I do this thing for Tim, there's 100 other people in this event. I didn't do that thing for Tim, or for them, I only did it for Tim. So be very careful when you're thinking, oh, this is good customer service, this is facilitating the play. If you go too far down that road, realize that you positively impact one person, negatively impact many others. A good, simple litmus test for that is go, okay, if I did this for everyone, what would be the impact on the event? Meg Baum recently was talking about a very good example of a good deviation, in my estimation, because while it was customer service for the first guy that came up, it wound up being good customer service for everybody else. And that was at a recent pre-release that did not involve snow-covered basics, or event. It might not have been a pre-release. The store had put out a bunch of basic lands, including piles of snow-covered mixed in with the regular basics. Now, snow-covered weren't in the format, so there was no value, gameplay-wise, to having snow-covered. So when a guy comes up and he has his deck, and a judge is like, why do you have snow-covered whatevers? He's like, that's what I got out of the box. It's like, you got these out of the box? It's like, yeah, the one the TO provided. All right, well, does it make sense in that scenario to good customer service deviate this guy of, oh, okay, I got two options. Do I make him swap it out? Or I just say, it's fine. Here's the key element in Meg's story. Instead of just dealing with that one player and going, wait a minute, the TO box, there's a lot of snow-covered lands in here. Hey, everybody, who here has snow-covered lands in your sealed deck? Half the room raises their hand. Boom. All right, there's a great customer service deviation you're going to apply to everyone, because you're just going to go, all right, thanks, please ignore the fact they're snow-covered. It doesn't affect gameplay, so you're not impacting the integrity of the event, but technically you're allowing people to play illegal cards. There's also no confusion from the players as to what the cards mean. So it's not impacting I'm playing the game according to a set of rules. It's not causing confusion there. And doing the whole room at once turns out, was good customer service for everyone. And I believe the experience that you've had there and the experience that you talked to anybody other than the most jerkiest of players of, hey, your opponent has snow-covered lands at a pre-release in a room full of people, and we gave them to is it okay if he just runs them? That they'd all be like, yeah, I get it. You know, a normal, honest, non-jerk is gonna understand that, and that winds up being a good criteria. Later, when someone goes, if I hear about that as a player and go, yeah, that's fair, that actually is a way that you can evaluate a deviation after the fact of, was this good or not? All right. So, how to deviate. Now we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts, ways to think about this. And I use two things. A, I use the textbook, and B, I use what I call the bar. The textbook is, here's this document that we have with lots of examples. Every example in the IPG exists for a reason. You know, you'll find out that brainstorming with green mana, like, it's there because people screwing up brainstorm happens. And there's a difference between I brainstorm and then I shuffle, and I could not have played my brainstorm with what I did. That example exists to illustrate game rule violation versus some other terrible brainstorm related violation. So if you're going through the document and you read those examples, every example, remind yourself, this is here because something like this has happened. Why did they pick this example? Why did they pick brainstorm instead of whatever else? And it's because brainstorm's our problem child and ruins all our lives. Now, as much as Dorset, congrats to the new kid. But, God forbid you brainstorm with Narset. Anyway, every example exists for a reason. And so if you're looking at a situation, player did whatever, and you're like, you know what, this reminds me of an example, go look at the book. If the example's there, don't deviate. It's there because it's so common that it's like, this is that common, it happens. Yeah, and you know what, when you're talking to a player and you're like, I feel bad for you, sometimes when you just add in, this is literally an example in our penalty guide, they'll be like, oh. And it's like, yep, you did the thing that lots of other people, congratulations, you joined the club. But if it's in the book, do not deviate. Deviations are about things that aren't in the book or otherwise in FUBAR. Those simple examples aren't FUBAR. They're bad, they feel bad, but they're there to try and illustrate the things that are going on. So that's your very first thing. You'll find that weed down an awful lot of those things where you think I want to deviate, and then you look and you're like, oh, wait a minute, here is literally that, either that or really close to that. The next thing is the bar system. Believable is B. That is, if I were to go to someone and say, here's what a player did, and here was my response. If they go, what? You did what? That's a good sign that I have made a poor choice. So when I think about, okay, what do I want to do here? And I think, okay, well, I want to do this. And I imagine telling someone, here's what I did. Whether it's someone at the event or someone, over Facebook Messenger or things like that. If I can sort of mentally picture their reaction and they're just like, I don't understand, that should be a good clue to you. Be very, very careful. It doesn't mean don't deviate. It means that double check your reasoning, double check your motivation. And that one, I put that first partially because it spells stuff, but also because a lot of times when we see problems, we have that natural instinct of I want to fix it. But that natural instinct, which we have as humans, is one of the things that most commonly trips us up. So start by doing a sanity check with yourself. That's what believable is all about. The second thing is abusable. That's a scenario where if you are going to do something for one person, if you had that situation happen multiple times, would it start to become very questionable? Now, if it's happening a lot, it's probably not significant and exceptional. So happening a lot means it fails the significant and exceptional check. You shouldn't be deviating. But picture in your mind, okay, if this for some reason happened multiple times, how would I feel about applying this fix multiple times? And if you realize, oh, I'll do this once, but I would never want to do it, at multiple times, that's probably a thing where you need to be like, nope, I don't need to be deviating there. I have a trap here, and that is, let's see, something that no one likes does not mean different is better. And that's where I brought up the randomly determining a winner rule. It's a great example because nobody liked the randomly determining a winner as a DQ, et cetera, et cetera. We just didn't like it. And the solution for that wasn't to ignore the infraction. That infraction existed because Magic is not a game of chance. And randomly determining stuff is a significant element in games of chance. That's why it exists. And most players, when they hear that, they understand it. A lot of judges don't necessarily have the background to understand how that got there. That's part of understanding the documents in a larger sense. But over time, we realized this draconian thing, which we implemented to try and squeeze it out of the players, wasn't having that effect. It was having the effect of players not understanding and being angry and upset. And when we tried to use this as an educational tool, all that would happen is they'd think, judges are jerks, and I don't like them. So the document even today is evolving into this thing where we can go, okay, I have to give you this penalty because it's a textbook thing, but we're now at a point where it's much less I don't like this, no one likes this. And that again goes back to give the feedback up the chain, give the feedback to the people that worry about this, so that we can make better choices. Right? The last thing, and I included this because it's super relevant, is Reddit. Reddit qualifies as all social media. If you're at an event, you're thinking about, do I deviate? Take a moment, just like you did the sanity check in your own head. Imagine you read a story on Reddit about how is this going to be presented to the public? How is a player who's about to go through this experience going to rant on the internet? Now, that doesn't mean that we allow people to get away with things or we deviate because we're trying to avoid social media. It just means that sometimes we're going to have to make rulings, sometimes we're going to have to make choices that are going to result in that. And the reality is, the Magic community in general actually cares for judges a great deal. They see the work that you do. And a lot of the community will be like, they'll see a rant and they'll be like, nah, the judge was trying his best, trying their best, trying her best, and they will have your back. But If you're imagining, okay, someone's gonna write this up, he's gonna be bitter and angry, this is how he's gonna be presenting it, whether it's the player or the opponent who saw this is a deviation, it should have been this other thing. If mentally thinking about how will this play out, if you don't have a good sense of here's how someone who is supportive of us as a community would respond to that or might view that, then maybe that's a sign that the decisions that you're making are going to lead into an awkward direction. It does not mean change your behavior based on Reddit, but it does mean that the choices you make as someone who is following policy or deviating from policy are going to come back on you. And I'll touch on that actually at the very end. And I'll cover this trap real quick, super important. Do not actually defend yourself on social media. If there's a post on Reddit about the pictures that were drawn on the results slip that caused you to disqualify a person, don't reply. Let other people reply. Yeah, that guy was wrong. Yeah, you have all the data. No, don't share the data. Let someone else pick it up and take care of it. That gets back to the community actually does trust and respect judges. It might be real tempting to have your say. As a judge, it's not your job to be part of that public discourse about a ruling that you were involved in. It can go real sideways sometimes and impact your reputation. All right. Moving on to what I think of as, we'll call it common deviations, but they're so common that we wouldn't necessarily think of them as deviations. Physical accommodations. That talks about stuff like fixed seating, super common. Technically, it's not how the system works, but a deviation is any time where you change the way the system works. That was like part of the system. Where we get into actual deviation-related stuff would be, I have a player who's got a cast on. We would almost never have an issue with, I have a player with a cast on needs some help shuffling. You might have to handle your manpower because of that, because you can't be, with that player all the time. You can't assign that person a judge, but it's reasonable to try and make some accommodations. If we go a little further down the road, I had a player for many years, profoundly blind. He wanted to play Magic. He wanted to play Magic with his Braille sleeves. The problem is the Brailler that punched the little dots onto the sleeves punched it all the way through the sleeves so you could see the sleeves. Now this is my personal experience, and these were my personal choices. The way that I handled that player was a simple agreement between him and I for my events, and that was you can play with your Braille sleeves. Technically they're marked, except he's blind, so he can't see them. The agreement is you cannot touch your library at all, except while you're shuffling, while you're drawing, and while you're doing a search effect, period. Caveat, your opponent can see, so if they can read Braille backwards and upside down, you might have a problem. If you're willing to accept that, then I'm willing to accept you having these things. Now, that's one guy. I've heard about some other folks that have Braille sleeves, but that's one guy in 22 years of judging. I think that qualifies as pretty significant / exception. As it turns out, his basic lands, he'd only use one letter. So when 2 events later, I'm like, I can tell which ones your basic lands are. You might want to add more letters. And so we wound up adding, because you can, it's only like some dots. And you're like, dots or tons of dots. You're like, oh, that's a land. But again, that's a sample of what I think of as a good customer service deviation. I don't need to apply it to everybody because most of us had functional eyes. And so I'm not worried about that part. And it's a thing where if the community saw that, they'd be like, oh, it's nice that they found a way for that guy to play Magic. I want more Magic players. Let's see, the trap on this one, don't use extra time as an accommodation. That automatically impacts everyone. Now, if something happens where a guy has to rush to a bathroom and come back, that's fine. But a guy who has mobility issues, get him into a fixed seat, but don't go, everybody has 50 minutes except you have 60. Don't do any sort of blanket, you get extra time thing. Only use that if there's a acute incident with a player that might need them to have extra time. All right, next on the common deviations section is religious accommodations. This can vary in different areas. In Seattle, for example, we have an Orthodox Jewish player. She cannot sign things on the Sabbath. It violates their particular code. the way that she handles that. She can play Magic, she just can't write. So when she's done with the game, calls a judge over, a judge signs on her behalf. If she needs to fill out a limited deck list, then a judge will come over after she's built the deck and then just write down the things that she's done. That's relatively reasonable. It's only a small number of individuals in any given event. Now, someone might ask the question, what if you're in part of the country where something like that's more common than Seattle? Well, you might have to vary how you handle that. If we take it to the natural extreme, running a Magic event in Tel Aviv, don't run it on the Sabbath. No TO should do that. Hopefully your TO would solve that. If we don't have a part of that, as judges, we don't have a part of that process. But I think you'd probably find that Tel Aviv Sabbath pre-release, bad idea. You'll also find as American, don't run stuff on Super Bowl Sunday. It's just that's a national religious holiday too. And things like that. We want to welcome everyone to our community. That means that there are sometimes going to be people that we will do a little extra effort for. And that is part of being that more inclusive, more welcoming community. All right, I haven't run into it yet, but I actually am hoping that someday we'll get to give a guy a time extension because he needs to pray facing whichever direction is correct and whatnot. But that would be another reasonable thing. It should take very little time. It's only a small amount of impact over the course of a given day, and chances are hopefully that match will get done easy, quickly. And again, it shows respect for the player as a person. It shows respect for the player as part of the community. Let's see. The last one on this is one that I personally use, and this is about players messing up their deck list. Whenever I'm running an event and we're collecting physical deck lists, I know it's archaic and old, but if we have physical deck lists, I always ask the judges, as you collect them, always check the name. Number doesn't really matter. Make sure you have the name. That's the instruction to every judge about every deck list. With limited, it's always check the name and the basic land, which means if later in the day we find a limited deck list which has no basic lands listed, because I've instructed the judge to do it, and the judges were responsible for doing it for every person in the event, the entire event got the same service. So I'm going to waive that penalty for having the deck list without the basic lands and limited. Technically, that's an exception. I think we can reasonably agree that that's one that many people have applied, et cetera. But the key there is, the judges was given the instructions that I do this. I do not miss an event where I don't specifically give this, because then it's on me having given that instruction. Don't assume if you're running an event that this is how it's done. It's not officially how it's done. But again, everyone got the same service, and the end result is a better experience for the community, because I think most Magic players would agree if they're saying that, yeah, boneheaded, left all the basic lands off my deck, not highly abusable, and certainly if it happened to you, you'd want someone to take a little bit of mercy. All right, let's move on to the last little bit, and that's how to evaluate your deviation. I have deviated, I've done the thing, and now I'm thinking about it, because judges always do this with their rulings. Did I do the right thing? In all honesty, it probably doesn't matter. If you're at the LGS, if you're at the MCQ, you've got your own communities to manage. Part of you having that relationship with the players is hopefully them respecting you for the good decisions you make and then forgiving you for the bad ones. Part of that is also being proud of yourself for the good decisions you make and forgiving yourselves for the bad ones you make. Eric, Levine, and I are both nodding our heads very big because we're good at making bad decisions, not so good at forgiving ourselves. It's a thing we all do. Judges are almost always perfectionists. So we're going to rethink our decisions. And the most toxic thing a judge can do when dealing with a deviation is let it get in their head and revisit it over and over and over again. If you make a good deviation, you're like, great, I'm proud of that. If you make a bad one, accept that you made a bad one and use that as impetus to try and think about how did I mess that up, to not screw it up again. Do not let it eat at you over and over again. That is not being a good caretaker to yourself. You're a member of the community too. You take good care of the players. Don't forget to take good care of your own thoughts. when players come up to you, they will often say, hey, I got this ruling, blah, blah, blah. We're very familiar with that. They will especially do that when they say, hey, a judge did this, it was weird. My recommendation there is if you're listening to a ruling and you realize this is aberrant in some way, to be like, oh, that sounds like a deviation. Like, it's very difficult for me to think about that if I've not been in the thing and it's bad form. I find just that phrase, bad form, for judges to second guess deviations. Most players will respect that and back off. If you want to talk about deviation among judges, without members of the public who understand the work that we go through, if you want to talk about that with peers, great, but understand, respect your peers. Even if you don't agree with the deviation, understand that that person has also put in a lot of work just like you have. And respect yourself. You put in a lot of work. You put in a lot of thought to that ruling. You put in a lot of study into the documents. Respect them, respect yourself. And there's a quote from the IPG that I want to call out in particular. If a judge makes a ruling that is consistent with the quoted text, that's again, don't deviate, then the complaints of the player shift from accusation of unfairness by the judge to accusations of unfair policy. If you just go, I don't know, should I deviate or not, and you just stick to the book, then it's on the book if the player is particularly upset. When you deviate, you are pulling it onto yourself to some degree. But if you stick to the book, then ultimately it's up to that text to deal with. And someone's like, hey, I don't like this, you did exactly the textbook thing. I mean, that is where we default. The last little litmus test, I touched on this earlier, is if you've deviated and you were to talk to a player or talk to a judge about it, if you watch their expression, you'll see how their head moves or how their reaction is. If they're like, yeah, that makes sense, or yeah, that's fair, that's actually one of the easiest litmus tests for did I handle this deviation well. If they stop and are like, huh, and have to think about it a bunch, maybe it needs more discussion, maybe it needs more work. But if their reaction is, okay, yeah, I get it, and you'll see this a lot with players, that's a sign that you probably threaded that needle and got it to where the community needs it to be and whatnot.